The velvet curtains were drawn tight, but not tight enough to silence history. Behind the doors of Henry VIII's bedchambers, lust battled disappointment, loyalty curdled into betrayal, and royal flesh bore both heirs and scandal. These rooms, draped in damask and shadow, were more than places of rest. They were the crucible where England's fate was shaped by whispered moans, muttered regrets, and dying breaths. From the bloodied linens of childbirth to the cold absence of consummation, from secrets whispered to the groom of the stool to death sentences born in jealousy, the king's bedrooms were never truly private. They were theaters of power, pain, and performance. What happened there did not stay there. It rippled across crowns, across courts, across centuries, and it began in bed. The royal bedchamber was never truly private. Draped in tapestries, lit by beeswax candles, and guarded by silence that only seemed to offer solitude, it was a room where England breathed in whispers. For Henry VIII, as with all Tudor monarchs, the bedchamber was not simply where the king laid his head, it was the theater in which power was most nakedly rehearsed. Here, the line between sovereign and servant blurred, not through intimacy, but through proximity. At dawn, the ritual of the king's rising, called the levee, saw a carefully choreographed ballet of chamberlains, physicians, and nobles who waited anxiously to be admitted. Each man, ranked by status, played a role in preparing the king for his day, handing him his shirt, his codpiece, his signet ring. These acts were not menial, they were political. To hand the king his breeches was to touch the machinery of monarchy, and at the heart of this curious intimacy stood the groom of the stool, a position both obscene and supreme. He managed the king's personal hygiene, kept records of his bowels, and whispered in his ear while others remained at the threshold. The groom, often a nobleman himself, became a gatekeeper of favor, privy to unfiltered thoughts, the stench of ulcers, and the soft groans of an aging ruler. Within the bedchamber, every object carried meaning. The bed, vast and canopied, was a stage for dynastic legitimacy. The sheets, inspected after wedding nights, bore witness to honor or fraud. The very walls heard pledges, arguments, confessions. It was here that Henry's deepest frustrations with Catherine of Aragon took form in murmured complaints. Here that he mused, perhaps aloud, that God cursed him with a barren union. But beyond passion or discontent, the chamber was a court unto itself. Letters were dictated from the pillows. Foreign ambassadors were sometimes received seated on the edge of the royal maîtresse, a disarming tactic meant to unsettle or seduce. The room offered both softness and scrutiny, a place where trust could be forged or assassins imagined. In later years, Henry's illness transformed these spaces into shadowy cathedrals of rot and fear. But even then, the routines remained. Courtiers still gathered outside the privy chamber, waiting for access that could define their fortunes. Politics passed through bed curtains. Policies were murmured over nightcaps, and secrets drew or false leaked like warm blood into the cold hallways beyond. In a world where the king's body was the body of the state, to tend to that body in its most vulnerable state was to wield something more potent than the sword: unfiltered access. It is no accident that lovers, doctors, traitors, and confessors all came through the same door. The royal bedchamber was not merely a room, it was an empire unto itself, one where linen bore the weight of crowns, and the silence between breath and sleep echoed louder than any trumpet in court. When Henry VIII married Catherine of Aragon in the summer of 1509, the nuptial bed became more than a symbol of royal union. It became a national altar upon which England offered its hopes for continuity, strength, and masculine renewal. The young king, barely 18 and flushed with the fire of youth, had inherited a crown still trembling from civil war and uncertainty, and he wore his new bride like a banner of peace. Catherine, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, was royal not only in blood but in bearing, her Spanish dignity concealing a past already marred by death and delay. She had been married to Henry's brother Arthur, who died shortly after their wedding, raising murmurs about whether their marriage had been consummated, murmurs that would one day thunder back with a vengeance. But in 1509, such doubts were drowned in pageantry. The wedding night itself was not a private affair, not truly. Eyes followed them to the threshold, ears pressed to stone, and servants waited for signals. The bed was consecrated with ritual, the sheets marked, the morning after examined for signs not of passion, but of penetration. For Henry, this was more than personal pleasure, it was public proof. To possess Catherine was to possess legitimacy. Chroniclers noted his vigor, his joy, his pride in his manhood. He was not merely king, he was a husband, a breeder, a living promise of dynastic rebirth. Songs were written, poems praised his virility. His body, young and unscarred, was likened to Mars, while Catherine became England's Venus. The people rejoiced not just for love, but for lineage. The bedroom became a cathedral of expectation. Each night was a potential turning point for history. Each missed conception, a silent tremor of doubt. And when Catherine's belly swelled with her first pregnancy, the kingdom held its breath. But this exhalation would not last. Over the coming years, miscarriages would follow, stillbirths would haunt their chambers, and Henry's confidence would rot in the shadows between those same silken sheets. Yet in those early nights, when hope had not yet soured into obsession, the wedding bed served its greatest function not as furniture, but as theater. Courtiers whispered of the king's appetite. Foreign ambassadors reported home of a marriage well begun and most honorably consummated. And as the young couple emerged from their chamber, cheeks flushed and garments rumpled just so, England exhaled. The Tudor rose bloomed anew, nourished by the illusion of a fertile union. But beneath the perfume of ceremony, beneath the orchestrated laughter and velvet hangings, the bed already bore the weight of expectation that no mortal could long endure. The king had performed, yes, but the play had only begun, and the curtain would not fall until blood stained both the bed and the crown. The bedchamber that once echoed with triumphant whispers now pulsed with dread, each closed door hiding another failed promise, another bloody sheet. Catherine of Aragon, once the hope of two dynasties, became a prisoner of biology and divine chance, her every pregnancy a national event and every miscarriage a private apocalypse. Within those gilded walls, hope curled and died like smoke. Between 1510 and 1518, Catherine conceived at least 6 times, yet only one child survived Mary, a daughter born in February 1516 to a kingdom that had prayed for a son. The first pregnancy had seemed a sign of divine favor, but the stillbirth that followed cracked the illusion. The second, a boy, died within weeks. The third was a girl who perished before she could be baptized. Servants began to tread more softly near the queen's chamber, and Henry's morning rituals grew darker with each quieting womb. The king, once so jubilant in his virility, began to see shadows on the walls. The Tudor bedchamber, his supposed fortress of fertility, had become a theater of decay. He looked at Catherine not just with sorrow, but with suspicion. Was this God's punishment? Had he sinned in marrying his brother's widow? The question clawed at his conscience and found fertile ground in Scripture. Leviticus 20:21 haunted his mind. If a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. They shall be childless. Though the Pope had granted dispensation, Henry began to wonder if divine law could be so easily dismissed. And as Catherine aged her body weary, her eyes rimmed red from weeping, the distance between them became a chasm that no ceremony could bridge. The bed became a battlefield where Henry's desperation collided with Catherine's shame. She, who had once soothed him with Spanish lullabies and warm arms, now offered only silence and failure. And Henry, for all his outward majesty, began to loathe that silence, to hear in it the voice of judgment. He did not rage at Catherine, not yet, but he grew colder, and when he turned away from her in bed, he turned toward prophecy. Whispers of annulment crept through court. Priests were summoned to his private rooms. He pored over Scripture while she bled alone. And all the while, England waited, confused, unsteady, watching the royal bed become a tomb for sons who never lived, and for a marriage that died not with betrayal, but with emptiness. In this way, theology slithered beneath the bed curtains, and the divine right of kings became entangled with the divine wrath of wombs. It was not a mistress, not a lover, not even ambition that ended Henry's marriage to Catherinite, was the quiet, repeated absence of a male cry in the dark hours of royal night. And in that absence, Henry found not only grief but purpose. He would not let a woman's body determine his dynasty. He would break the bed itself before he accepted such a fate. Before Anne Boleyn ever stepped inside the king's bedchamber, she had already possessed him more completely than any woman before her. She danced in the corridors of his mind like a flame just out of reach, elusive, sharp-tongued, and terrifyingly alive. Unlike Catherine, who had come wrapped in the holy dignity of Spanish virtue, Anne came wrapped in danger. Their affair unfolded not in sheets but in glances, in letters, in carefully staged withdrawals. She withheld her body with the precision of a surgeon, slicing away the king's patience and replacing it with obsession. Years passed before he ever touched her flesh, but he touched the idea of her nightly, over and over, constructing a fantasy so potent that it threatened to undo the very structure of Christendom. For Anne, the bed was not simply a place of consummation, it was the final lever of power. When at last she gave in after, the Pope refused to grant an annulment, and Henry, drunk on frustration and lust, broke from Rome entirely. They married in secret, and the long-awaited night became a national inflection point. But the fantasy could not survive its fulfillment. The bed, once sacred in anticipation, became profane under pressure. Anne, now queen, was expected to do what Catherine could not: produce a son. And when her belly grew round with promise, the court braced itself for history. But the child who came into the world in September of 1533 was not the longed-for heir. She was Elizabeth, brilliant, red-haired, alive, but female. The midwives wrapped her tightly and placed her in her mother's arms with trembling courtesy. Henry, it is said, forced a smile. The court celebrated publicly, of course, for no child of the king could be met with silence. Yet behind chamber doors Anne saw the flicker of disappointment, the shift in his voice, the way his hand fell from her shoulder a moment too soon. She tried again several times. Another miscarriage, then another, the last of which came shortly after Henry's jousting accident in 1536. She was pregnant again, and the shock of seeing her husband's unconscious, bloated form pulled from the field may have ended that final hope. The Queen's chambers, once electric with promise, now sagged under the weight of unspoken recrimination. The same allure that had once lifted her above all others now made her suspect. She had promised too much. The whispers returned this time not about seduction, but sorcery. The king's desire curdled into fear. His glances became cold, his visits infrequent. And in the stillness of that fading intimacy, Anne Boleyn began to understand that the bed she had fought so hard to enter was no sanctuary, it was a scaffold in disguise. Her daughter would become England's greatest monarch, but for Anne, the failure to deliver a boy was not merely personal, it was fatal. The same bed that once throbbed with expectation now echoed with the creak of steps leading to the block. The same chamber that once glowed with candlelight and trembling ecstasy now dimmed under the weight of accusation, its silken tapestries hiding secrets that would be dragged into the light and weaponized. Anne Boleyn's failure to give the king a son had not merely disappointed, it had unbalanced the scales of power. And in a court where the king's desire was law, that imbalance required blood to restore order. Her bedchamber, once the envy of every lady at court, became the epicenter of whispered betrayals. It was there, behind carved oak doors and perfumed curtains, that the seeds of her ruin supposedly sprouted. Glances held too long, doors locked too late, laughter that rang too freely. The accusations came swiftly. Mark Smeaton, a court musician, was first to fall, tortured into confessing that he had known the Queen carnally within the sanctity of her own rooms. Then came Sir Henry Norris, a close friend of the king. Then her own brother, George Boleyn. The list stretched with sickening boldness, each name more outrageous than the last. The details were salacious midnight trysts, bedsheets disturbed, kisses stolen while servants pretended not to see. These weren't merely stories, they were evidence, grotesquely arranged to indict a queen and satisfy a king's wounded pride. During her trial, Anne stood firm, her eyes steady even as they quoted her own words back to her, twisted into sedition. She was accused not only of adultery, but of plotting the king's death, of speaking those thoughts aloud, perhaps between the sheets, where confession and confidence once mingled with sweat and sighs. The bed had become a witness, its silence now a gaping absence where the truth might have lived. She denied everything, But truth was no longer the currency of court perception was. And the perception, carefully cultivated, was that the queen had defiled not just her marriage, but the very sanctity of royal succession. Her bed was now a crime scene. The same sheets that once caught the king's desire now bore the stain of disgrace. Servants were interrogated, chambermaids compelled to recount movements, gestures, snatches of overheard conversation. A queen's body, once the hope of an empire, was now subject to forensic curiosity. Anne Boleyn was condemned, not simply for her womb's failure, but for her bedroom's treason. On the morning of her execution, she prepared herself within those same walls, composed, prayerful, perhaps even relieved that the long siege had reached its end. She did not die in the chamber, but part of her was buried there long before her neck met the blade. For in Henry's court, to fall from favor was to be stripped of the very space that once defined you. The royal bed, once a place of pleasure, now offered only proof of guilt. And when Anne stepped out for the last time, the door closed not on a love affair, but on a woman devoured by the very intimacy that once promised her the crown. The chamber that had once echoed with betrayal and execution now pulsed with a different rhythm, quiet, reverent, and steeped in hope so fragile it felt sacred. When Jane Seymour ascended to queenship mere days after Anne Boleyn's beheading, it was not with the fire of seduction but with the cool grace of obedience and fertility promised. She was everything. Anne was not gentle, submissive, untouched by scandal, and the king clung to her as a balm for his bruised pride and an instrument for his salvation. The court hushed when her belly began to swell. Physicians hovered, astrologers whispered favorable signs, and the corridors leading to her chamber were scrubbed daily, as though cleanliness might ward off fate. And then, on a cold October night in 1537, after 2 days of excruciating labor behind tightly sealed doors, Jane Seymour delivered what no queen had before, a living, legitimate son. Edward, Prince of Wales, was placed in Henry's trembling arms, and for a fleeting moment the specter of mortality lifted. The bed where Jane lay, her face pale and drawn, became a throne of triumph. The king called her his true wife, the mother of his heir, the fulfillment of all the silent prayers muttered in darkened rooms for decades. England celebrated, bonfires blazed. Church bells rang across a land that had nearly forgotten joy. But the chamber did not remain a sanctuary. Within days, fever gripped Jane's body, and the same bed that had borne life now became an altar of dying. Her womb had opened the future, but the act had bled her into the past. Midwives sponged her brow with rose water. Priests muttered final rites beside tapestries embroidered with saints, and the infant prince wailed as his mother drifted toward silence. Henry did not leave her side. For all his cruelty, all his shifting affections and political coldness, he remained rooted beside her bed, watching the light dim behind her eyes, unable to command it to stay. When she died, 12 days after her great triumph, the king ordered her chamber preserved as it had been, that neither linens untouched, her scent lingering in the air. No other room in his palaces would be so revered. The queen had done what no woman before her could. She had justified his sacrifices, his reformation, his break with Rome, and the corpses left in her wake. And yet she had paid in full with her life. The irony was cruel and not lost on him. Henry would go on to marry again several times, but he would be buried beside Jane Seymour. Her chamber, once filled with blood and cries and incense, became a shrine where triumph and tragedy lay tangled beneath the same sheets. The king had his son, but the cost had been absolute. In Jane's bed, Henry experienced not just fulfillment, but a grief so profound it would haunt him until his own final breath, gasped far from love, surrounded only by memory and rot. The bed stood prepared, linens turned down, candles flickering in silver sconces, and yet the room pulsed with something sour, something uneasy weight of expectation sharpened into dread. Anne of Cleves, a princess of the German duchies, had been chosen for Henry not by desire but by diplomacy, her portrait painted by Holbein, suggesting a gentle, modest beauty fit for a king wearied by death and scandal. But art, as Henry would soon proclaim, had lied. The moment he laid eyes on her in person, the illusion fractured. He had disguised himself, approached her in romantic jest, and expected a gasp of recognition, of chemistry. Instead, he received a blank stare, an awkward curtsy. The court watched as the monarch, once ravenous for conquest, recoiled. Still, the wedding preceded necessity, and political alliance demanded it. But the consummation, the moment meant to seal union with flesh, unraveled into farce. Henry later confided to his physicians and closest courtiers that he could not perform. He claimed she smelled, that her breasts sagged, that her body was unfamiliar, repellent, unready. Worse still, he declared, was her ignorance believed her to be no virgin, or at least no innocent. She did not react as a maiden should. He claimed to have touched her belly and found it soft and slack, like a woman who had borne children. Whether true or concocted, these declarations weaponized the bed as courtroom. Anne, bewildered, never publicly refuted her husband's private rejection. Instead, she remained silent, compliant. She had entered the chamber as queen, and within weeks exited as the king's sister, a title offered as compensation for the humiliation of annulment. The annulment itself centered on that very bedroom. Because the marriage had not been consummated, it was declared null and void, no sin, no scandal, merely failure. But the bed, that empty, undisturbed bed, became the most damning witness of all. No bloodied sheet, no sighs heard beyond the curtain, no air in the making, only coldness. A man's disgust crystallized into political doctrine. And while Anne was spared, the fates of Catherine or Anne Boleyn lost no head, bore no accusation. Her chamber became a mausoleum of royal contempt. It would remain untouched for years, the servants saying the king would not even walk past it. Holbein's portrait, once praised, was quietly blamed. Diplomats squirmed. And Anne, the woman who had never been truly a wife, lived out her days in royal favor, yes, but not in intimacy. The irony curdled. She had survived Henry because she had never touched him. In the grand ledger of Henry's marriages, hers is often glossed over as brief, bloodless. Yet within its folds lies a revelation: the bed, once a place of conquest and continuity, could also become a symbol of impotence and revulsion. The king, mighty and ruthless, had fled not from war or treason, but from the simple act of lying beside a woman he could not desire. In Anne's chamber, rejection wore velvet, and disgust was given the force of law. The chamber was warm with youth and perfume, its silken cushions and carved bedposts wrapped not in ceremony, but in whispered giggles and fleeting glances that defied the cold machinery of courtly duty. Catherine Howard, barely a woman and already a queen, had been chosen not for politics or alliance, but for pleasure. Henry's attempt to reclaim lost virility through the bloom of adolescent charm. Her laughter revived him. Her beauty stirred the echoes of a man he once believed himself to be. Yet while the king's body rotted slowly from ulcers and weight and time, Catherine's pulsed with hunger for life, for intimacy, for love. It began innocently, perhaps, as eyes lingering too long, hands brushing in hallways, but it did not stay innocent. In the quiet hours, long after the king had retired to his own distant quarters, Thomas Culpeper Young, bold and dashing, slipped through guarded corridors and entered her chamber. The queen's bed, once a tool of royal legitimacy, became instead the stage for treason in silk. Lady Rochford, Anne Boleyn's widowed sister-in-law, served as confidant and accomplice, arranging the meetings, dousing the candles, and keeping the guards away. Catherine, naive yet reckless, penned notes of affection to Culpeper, letters filled with longing, signed with trembling hands. She called him hers, dared to dream of another life within the walls that now confined her. But the court, always hungry for scandal, heard the rustling behind the doors. A chambermaid spoke. A discarded letter surfaced. The king, once tender with his bride, now froze in disbelief as evidence mounted like fog before a storm. Interrogations followed. Servants broke. Lady Rochford confessed. Culpeper, cornered, admitted that he had intended to go further if he had not already. The queen, summoned and pale, could not deny what had occurred in the dark. Her chamber, now stripped of innocence, became a courtroom in fabric and wood. Every cushion, every schedule of entry, every whispered exchange was dissected by ministers and clergy. The bed where she had once whispered secrets now whispered them without her. Culpeper was executed, drawn and quartered, his body dismembered for a love that dared touch a queen. Lady Rochford, shattered by guilt or madness, followed, and Catherine poor, doomed Catherine was imprisoned in the very rooms that had once housed her laughter. On the morning of her execution, she asked for the block to be brought to her quarters, so she might rehearse laying her head upon it. Whether this request was granted, no one knows for certain, but the image remains. A girl, barely past girlhood, kneeling beside her own bed, pressing her neck to wood in a room that had once promised pleasure and now whispered only death. The chamber bore witness to her final hours, a silent conspirator in a crime born not of ambition, but of desire. And for Henry, the bed had betrayed him again, another wife, another wound, another echo in the long corridor of closed doors and broken vows. The last queen entered the chamber not as a seductress or symbol of fertility, but as a scholar cloaked in silence, a nurse swathed in patience. Catherine Parr, Henry's sixth and final wife, knew that the royal bed was no longer a place for intimacy. It was a battlefield of breath and blood, watched by eyes both mortal and divine. She arrived not in the bloom of youth, but with the calm steel of a woman who understood danger and who had already buried 2 husbands. Henry was old now, swollen with infection, his leg ulcer oozing and reeking beneath velvet robes, his mood volatile, his appetite dulled by the taste of too many betrayals. The king no longer demanded passion but demanded loyalty, obedience, and above all, calm. Catherine gave him all 3. In the bedchamber, she read to him scripture, mostly, but laced with careful opinions, calculated to test his theological boundaries without pressing too hard. She massaged his aching limbs, kissed his corrupted hands, and listened as he drifted between lucidity and suspicion. Her chamber became not a place of pleasure, but of vigilance. Courtiers watched her every movement. Enemies, especially the conservative factions of the court, longed to bring her down, whispering that she harbored Protestant heresies beneath her polished smile. And at one point, they nearly succeeded. A warrant was drawn for her arrest, her books seized, her name scribbled beside charges of sedition. It was in that moment, behind the same doors where queens had died, that Catherine played her most dangerous hand. She approached Henry not with argument, but with submission. She told him she spoke of Scripture only to distract him from his pain, to comfort him, to serve him. She made the royal bed a sanctuary of compliance. And he, swollen with flattery and fear of loneliness, burned the warrant with his own hands. From then on, she tread even more carefully. She became a healer, not a Lavera woman whose presence calmed the beast but never provoked the man. She dressed his wounds with lavender oil, spoke softly of unity and legacy, and ensured that when the king slept, his dreams were peaceful. Hers, perhaps, were not. The bed still held the ghosts of Anne, of Catherine, of Jane and Catherine again. She knew how quickly it could become an executioner's waiting room. But she survived by speaking less, by loving wisely, by keeping her prayers quieter than her breath. When Henry died in 1547, bloated and raving, it was Catherine who closed his eyes. She had outlived him, outmaneuvered him, and outlasted the curse of the crown's touch. Her chamber, unlike those of her predecessors, was not soaked in blood or scandal, but in the slow ache of self-denial. In that space, she had not just survived Henry VIII had tamed him, and in doing so, she turned the bed from a weapon back into a place of rest, if only for a while. In the final years of Henry VIII's life, the royal bedchamber, once alive with lust, lineage, and lethal seduction, decayed into a realm of festering flesh and ceremonial Pythia prison, where the myth of majesty was stripped bare by the smell of rot and the moans of a broken man. The monarch who had once danced, jousted, and bedded queens with the force of divine right now struggled to lift his own bulk from blood-stained sheets. His legs, grotesquely swollen and ulcerous, leaked pus into bandages that had to be changed several times a day. His face, once radiant with power, had bloated beyond recognition, eyes sunken, lips cracked, breath thick with decay. The great bed, once built for pleasure and dynasty, now served as scaffold, latrine, and sickroom. Servantsome loyal, some terrified performed a daily theater of cleanliness, bathing his infected limbs in herbs and wine, lifting folds of flesh with padded gloves, hiding their revulsion behind fixed expressions of duty. He was rarely alone, yet always isolated, surrounded by whispers that danced between reverence and horror. Physicians came and went, suggesting leeching, poultices, and concoctions too vile for even a beast to swallow. The groom of the stool, once a post of strange honor, became a silent witness to the king's humbling his daily struggle to urinate, his screams as the ulcers burst, his pleas for sleep that would not come. Courtiers, fearful of offending the man who could still sign death warrants with trembling fingers, tiptoed near his bed but never truly looked upon him. None dared speak aloud the truth that his body had betrayed the empire it once ruled. His impotence, once dismissed as passing weakness, became permanent. He could no longer perform in the bedroom, not as a man, not as a monarch. The power he had wielded in silken sheets, commanding wombs and destinies, had withered with the very organ that once justified his cruelty. Rumors gruesome said the stench of his wound preceded him by several feet, others that he had to be winched into bed with a system of ropes and pulleys. He no longer summoned his wives but watched them from afar, his bed a throne of putrefaction. And yet, through it all, the rituals endured. The linens were changed, the tapestries maintained, the chamber kept in lavish order, as though the majesty of the room could mask the collapse of the man within it. Even in suffering, the bed had to project strength. But for those who saw behind the curtain, who changed the dressings, who wiped the sweat from his trembling brow, it was clear. The king who once ruled his kingdom with sword and seed now ruled nothing, not even his own body. The contrast was unbearable, the irony complete. The same bed that had once been a furnace of virility now bore witness to the slow, grotesque undoing of a god-king, undone not by sword or traitor, but by flesh, time, and rot. Each dawn in Henry's bedchamber unfolded like a grim pageant, a theater of flesh and formality where ritual replaced rest, and the king's body bulging, blistered, and belching decay was treated not as mortal but as relic, as prophecy. The sacred rites of waking, dressing, and relieving himself were codified into a structure so rigid it defied the putrefaction it sought to conceal. At the heart of this grotesque ballet stood the groom of the stool, a title, half laughed at by posterity, but one that held terrifying power in its time. The man who wiped the royal backside also held the sovereign's whispered confessions, his dreams, his nighttime grievances, his gasped fears. He recorded the monarch's bowel movements in journals with dutiful precision, texture, color, timing, because in a court where the king's digestion reflected the health of the nation, a bout of constipation could ripple through politics like plague. This man, often a noble, rose not through arms but through excrement. He attended the king as he sat groaning atop a padded chair with a hidden chamber pot, offering soothing conversation or scripture depending on the mood. Afterward, he helped clean the monarch with linen cloths soaked in vinegar and rosewater, disguising the stench of decay with floral lies. Yet he was more than a hygienic shadow. He delivered nightly reports to the privy chamber. Did the king sleep? Did he speak in his dreams? Was his urine cloudy? Did he call out for a dead wife or mutter about treason? These fragments, gathered in the shadows of royal vulnerability, were analyzed like auguries. Sleep patterns were parsed for signs of divine favor. A fevered twitch might provoke diplomatic hesitation. If the king moaned a name, Mary, Anne, Edward, letters might be drafted, alliances re-evaluated. The chamber thus became a nerve center of surveillance, not imposed upon the king, but flowing outward from him like infected blood from a wound. Courtiers jostled for proximity to the bedroom, not to see the king at his best, but to study him at his worst, sweaty, delirious, half-naked. Rumors of his moods would begin with the groom of the stool and fan outward like wildfire, reaching foreign courts before they ever reached the man himself, and the rituals extended beyond the body. Each night, the great bed was inspected, the tapestries drawn just so, the rushes changed beneath his feet. A full set of attendants stood watch even as he slept, listening to every grunt and mutter. Candles flickered against the walls as if afraid to reveal too much. The illusion of majesty had to be maintained even when the king soiled himself or cried out in fear of death. The groom, the only soul permitted to speak plainly in those twilight hours, held a power that no sword could match: intimate access. And in Henry's world, where love had failed, heirs had disappointed, and strength had bled away into putrefaction, the true throne was not made of gold or iron, but of wood and linen and shame. The chamber was not his sanctuary. it was his cage. What occurred within the four-posted confines of Henry VIII's bed never stayed hidden for long. It spilled into kitchens, taverns, and chancelleries with the force of gospel, and each creak of the royal mattress was twisted into prophecy, scandal, or treason. The king's chamber, thick with velvet and silence, stood not as a wall between public and private, but as a stage behind a scrim half-seen, half-imagined, and wholly politicized. In a world where the monarch's flesh was the axis of the realm, every groan, every sleepless night, every sudden silence became fodder for a court obsessed with signs. The consummation of a marriage was not merely a personal act, it was a geopolitical contract, a declaration of legitimacy. On the night of each royal wedding, the entire court held its breath, and the morning brought a ritual as old as monarchy itself, the presentation of the bedsheets. Linen, once soft and intimate, was now stiff with expectation. If blood was shown, heads nodded with relief. If the sheets were clean or worse, hidden suspicions festered. The absence of sound beyond the chamber door could mean divine displeasure, or erectile failure, or deceit. When Henry married Anne of Cleves and emerged tight-lipped and pale, it was not long before whispered jokes turned to diplomatic strain. His claim that he liked her not after touching her body withered into political crisis, for if the marriage had not been consummated, it could be annulled without bloodshed, but if it had, then England was bound to her Protestant German allies by flesh. Thus, courtiers parsed sighs for sincerity, watched the king's face for the subtle bruises of rejection, and questioned chambermaids like spies. A queen's touch or lack thereof could sway treaties. The same court that celebrated Jane Seymour's postpartum glow took to speculating about Catherine Howard's flushed cheeks and the frequency of Culpeper's visits. Ministers weighed gossip like evidence, knowing that what happened in bed could reverberate in Parliament. Even impotence became a political weapon. If the king failed to perform, some whispered, was he cursed? Was the marriage invalid? Could he be deposed? The monarchy rested on the presumption of virility. No one dared speak of it openly, but the rumors churned nonetheless, first in corridors, then in foreign letters. Ambassadors wrote home about the king's declining appetite, his absences from his queen's bed, his physician's sleepless vigils. These weren't idle observations, they were warnings, signals to the wider world that England's throne trembled not from armies, but from a man's groin. And it wasn't only royal dignity at stake. Entire lineages, titles, and fortunes clung to the success of a single night's work. For Henry, the bed was no sanctuary. It was a stage built upon linen and fear, and he performed nightly for a kingdom that demanded proof of his manhood. But in truth, he was never alone there. Behind every curtain stood a nation watching, waiting, whispering. The echoes of that room reached far beyond the palace walls, reminding all that kings may sleep behind doors but their dreams are never their own. Long after Henry VIII's body had collapsed into the tomb beside Jane Seymour, the chambers where he once whispered seductions and decrees remained, some intact, some erased, and others meticulously reconstructed by centuries desperate to glimpse power in its most intimate form. Hampton Court still breathes with the residue of his breath, its bedchambers restored in dark oak and deep crimson, each candlelit alcove echoing with footsteps that no longer fall. Here, tourists now walk through the same corridors where Henry waited for news of laboring wives or schemed against those who failed to deliver him sons. The bed in the great watching chamber is no longer warmed by flesh but by camera flashes and reverent silence. It is a reliquary, not of romance, but of royal anxiety, preserved as if its linens still whisper with the breath of dying queens. At Whitehall Palace, once his grandest residence, the king's private quarters were consumed by fire in 1698, an inferno that devoured not only furniture but memory, erasing the very place where Henry likely spent his final days, soaked in fever and regret. All that remains are descriptions and inventories, the gold-threaded curtains, the carved headboard adorned with Tudor roses, the narrow chamber pot beneath the velvet-hung throne. The ashes of Whitehall's bedchamber became a void into which myth poured freely. At Hever Castle, once Anne Boleyn's childhood home and later gifted to Anne of Cleves after her failed marriage, the rooms have been painstakingly staged to replicate Tudor life. Visitors press their palms against cool stone walls, and try to imagine Henry's footsteps echoing through the halls, his hands brushing tapestries, his shadow leaning over a girl he would one day kill. These rooms, now curated and softened for public consumption, once pulsed with decisions that shattered lives. Yet the curation itself tells a story how a kingdom metabolizes its shame, transforming chambers of flesh and blood into curated memory. The beds are pristine now, roped off, their mattresses never slept in. But even in sterilized silence, the specter of sweat and weeping lingers. These spaces, once forbidden and private, are now purchased in ticketed tours, their intimacy repackaged into heritage. Yet they remain haunted not by ghosts, but by contradiction. Power once laid here, stripped bare and vulnerable, rotting beneath silks. Now, visitors shuffle through with guidebooks and headphones, unaware that beneath their feet lies the residue of fear and failure. The same bed that once sealed political alliances and exposed mortal weakness is now a backdrop for family photographs. No longer chambers of scandal or execution, these rooms are symbols of the monarchy's fragility, monuments not to triumph, but to how quickly glory curdles into spectacle. The king who broke with Rome to control his marriage bed now lies scattered across gift shops and interpretive plaques. His bedrooms, once arenas of lust, betrayal, birth, and death, have become shrines to history's most grotesque paradox, that even the most intimate spaces of absolute power cannot escape time's patient erosion. In the end, Henry VIII, warrior, sovereign, reformer, tyrant, left behind no greater monument than the beds in which he lay, grand, canopied, thick with fabric and fate. For all his dominion over armies, churches, and laws, the one realm he could never subdue was the sacred, terrifying privacy of his own chamber. It was there, not in council halls or battlefields, that his power was most naked, most contested, and most betrayed. Each bed he entered bore witness not to passion, but to performance of masculinity, of authority, of dynasty. He sought sons in those sheets, and found instead daughters, ghosts, and silence. He brought queens to ruin with the same hands that once caressed them. He commanded love and loyalty, but received only shadows of what he craved. The marital beds became tombs of Catherine's fertility, of Anne's ambition, of Jane's life, of Catherine Howard's youth. Even Catherine Parr's survival was measured in restraint, not affection. His body, once the engine of seduction and command, collapsed into boils and impotence, and the very rooms that had once been fortresses of seduction became prisons of rot. His courtiers recorded his moans like scripture, physicians studied his waist like omens, and enemies waited for the silence that would signal the end. The myth of Henry, larger than life, cruel, magnificent, was not written solely in declarations or victories, but in the frailty of his flesh against the linen of expectation. His reign changed the world, yes, but not by sword alone. The Reformation, the break from Rome, the reshaping of English monarchy, these began not in ideology, but in frustration, in longing, in the echo of empty cradles. He turned his private desire into public law, his bedroom doubts into constitutional crisis. He made England kneel before his wounded pride, cloaked in the language of Providence. And yet for all the violence and change he unleashed, he could not make a womb obey, nor still the decay eating him from within. The royal bedchamber, meant to be the forge of legacy, became instead a series of mirror seats, one reflecting back not triumph, but fear, not control, but chaos. Not immortality, but the desperate, sweating mortality of a man who believed he was above it. And now, centuries later, it is not his armor we remember most, but his silk stained with loss, his bedposts carved with dreams that never lived, the creaking wood that bore witness to the unraveling of a myth, the bedroom once sealed, secret, sacristies open now, visited daily by strangers who peer in and wonder. And so Henry lives on, not in the image of eternal majesty, but as a caution that even a king, in the soft and terrible dark of night, is just a man reaching for something he cannot command: love, loyalty, life itself, and watching it slip, again and again, into the folds of the bed.